Wholeness, welcome. This is Josh Dippold of Inner Skilled, and today I have Joel Bouchard with me, right? Bouchard?
Yeah, Bouchard. Yep.
Bouchard. Hey, what's going on today?
Not much. I appreciate you having me on.
Well, it's so weird. The internet connection dropped, and at least we didn't get too far into it here. And I think I'm not going to mute my microphone on this one. And we had audio issues at front, but hey, this is real life, right? These
Yep.
things happen sometimes. So, standard question: who is Joel, and what does he do?
So, I'm a guy who does a lot of things, right? I work in the manufacturing sector, managing a factory that makes parts for the electrical grid. I'm a PhD student in psychology. I'm a local government official. I'm a musician, so I've got albums on iTunes and Spotify and wherever you listen to music. I've written a book that should be coming out this summer, and I like to paint and do a whole bunch of other hobbies that are sort of difficult to pin down in a single sentence. But I've got a philosophy podcast from Nowhere to Nothing.
And I listened to a little bit of a couple episodes today, the recent one. So that's what I had time for. And yeah, it was really go into depth. So we're just going to jump right in here, since you're cool with it from our first take we tried here. Is what is it? What is this self? We take this for granted a lot of times. You know, as a base level of and we deal into existential things or just pretty much anything. But at the core of this is this notion of personhood or agency or existence, this type of thing. So in your current understanding, what is the self? What is this I, me, mine, you, they, them, this type of thing?
Yeah, there's a bunch of different ways you can look at it, right? Eastern philosophical traditions, which kind of view the self as illusory, sort of. It's kind of a thing that doesn't really exist. You can look at Western philosophical traditions that place a lot more emphasis on the autonomy of the person and how they take responsibility for themselves and their future. You can look at it psychologically, and that sort of splits the difference between the two in some ways. But there's a lot of overlap, and there's some places where they agree in ways that raises interesting questions, right? Like the ship of Theseus thought experiment, right? If you have this old warship and you want to preserve it, so as it starts to deteriorate, you replace it board by board. And then hundreds of years later, there's not a single original board, right? And you go, so is this the ship of Theseus, or is this something different? And when you look at the human body, there's not a single cell that is the same from 7 years ago. So are you the same human body, right? And if, the ship of Theseus, if you took all the old boards and put them back together, well, is that the ship, or is the new boards the ship? Is it just the plan, the layout of the ship? Is that what makes it, what gives it an identity, right? And so human beings, right, when we look at it, we can look at it in a physicalist way and say, okay, well, do our cells make us up? Or is it our memories? Or what determines what we are as a self, right? And then even our memories and the way that we interact with the world changes from moment to moment, right? And there was another Western philosopher, right, who said, can you stand in the same stream twice? What makes the stream the stream? Is it the water? Or as you step in, is it the molecules that flow past you? Because if that's the case, then no, you can never stand in the same stream twice. So science, psychological science has looked at this pretty closely and said, well, what is the enduring self, right? As you look at things, is it, are there core elements of a person that do not change over the course of their life, and can we identify that as them? Or does everything change from moment to moment, and really it's just our prefrontal cortex sort of like trying to tie things together to make it seem as if there's a coherent self? And the jury's out, but it tends to look as if our sort of notion of ourselves as this enduring thing that goes throughout time really doesn't exist the way we think it does.
Well, absolutely. And, my background is more in studying and practicing Buddhism, even though I wouldn't consider myself a Buddhist or whatever. But yeah, so you've mentioned the body, right? Basically, we could classify it as a lot of the cellular level on through the ship pieces. And right, this is kind of, well, I mean, on one level. But then you talked about memory and kind of the mind level. And they break it, it's broken down the five aggregates, right? So we've got the body. But what's also is the feelings, right? This experience that something is pleasant or unpleasant, and sometimes it's neither of those. But for the most part, our experience has this feeling tone, this valence. It's that experience has. It's either pleasant, unpleasant, neither. And this drives. I mean, it's associated. I mean, if you boil down kind of emotion or emotional experience, it comes down to that. I think so. It's about deconstructing this. Then we've got perception, right? The recognition. So, like, what we're really seeing, I guess, is kind of color and shape and light in a form. But there's a recognition process, right? There's a naming process to what that is. We recognize this and we give it a name. And so I call this a computer that I'm looking at, right? And the image is Joel on the screen, right? But that's not exactly what it is, right? This is agreed upon perception. And yeah, and then there's the formations. We've got, I can think from formations or fabrications of mind, right? We've got mental formations, we've got, and then volitional formations. There's a volition to formulate these in this encompasses kind of the whole mental sphere. And then consciousness, that's a huge one. And yeah, which one do we kind of identify most with? And are we always identifying with that? And then we can break those down too. Am I the body? Do I own the body? Is the body in me or am I in the body? And then do that for feeling and for perception. It starts to be almost mind blowing sometimes. Am I perception? Do I own it? Am I in it or is it in me? And so we see that a lot of the ways we identify or see the world or experience the world is different from person to person or whatever, and it can change throughout our lifetime or even moment to moment experience. So like you're saying, because of the changing nature, the incessant arising, existing then passing away of phenomena, there is really no stability in all this. It's kind of ceaselessly arising and perishing. Anything that's subject to arising is also subject to perishing. And even with a mountain, it's something that we think will be there first anyway. So, but over the eons, we will see that some mountain ranges have, and given enough time, they won't exist in the same way they will. And what I find further, and then I guess we get into this notion of existentialism, right? And existence. And one of the things that really put this to rest for me is when someone asked the Buddha, after full awakening, the tetralemma, right? After full awakening, will I exist? Won't I exist? Will I both exist and not exist? Or will I neither exist nor not exist? And he says it doesn't fit the case, doesn't apply. And I'm just like, so this whole notion of existentialism, when I feel that when there's full awakening, that whole topic doesn't fit the case, and it's just
Yeah.
unfathomable to, so yeah, how do you, what kind, so if you have, I'm sure you have plenty to say on this.
Yeah, I think that existentialism, as a point of view, um, really identifies with the emotional element of the human experience as being paramount. But I think that what we can see and what you've sort of talked about here is that element is again something that's very illusory, right? I know as somebody who practices, Zen, Shikanta Zen, right? Zen practice, that the things that used to make you angry or upset or frightened, with just a little bit of mindfulness, suddenly don't do that anymore. So were those emotions real in the sense that, not in the sense that I perceived them, right? That I experienced them, but did they mean anything, right? And I think that once you can sort of undermine that foundation of emotional salience, existentialism kind of falls apart a little bit. And perception, right? Perception, that's something that we tend to take for granted. But once you dig into the physiology of perception, that starts to fall apart, right? Color doesn't exist in reality. It's not a thing, right? It's just a mechanism that our brain uses to distinguish one type of thing from another based off of the amount of light that it reflects and absorbs. Um, Audio waves kind of similar, right? So our perception, our proprioception, these things are all they appear very real to us because we have evolved in order to use them as tools to navigate through our physical environments. But when you start to pick them apart and to try to dig down in a sort of empirical reductionist way into what it is or does it exist, you quickly get into the quantum stuff of, like the Buddha was saying, right? Well, does it, doesn't it? Does the question even make sense, right? And there's a Zen parable I like about it where, there's a servant who was tasked with cleaning his master's quarters, and there was an old vase, very expensive, and he accidentally bumped it and it broke. And the master, who was known for being a very hard master, he said to him, "Oh, I'm so sorry. Please don't kick me out of the temple." And the master said, "Oh, no problem. It's fine." And he goes, "Oh, I was expecting you to be so much more mad." And the master said, "Well, in my mind, the vase was already broken, right?" And that's highlighting what you were saying, right? If you go back far enough in time, or you go far enough forward in time, there's nothing that's stable, right? Nothing at all, even down to subatomic particles, atoms and protons and stuff. There are some things that science says, well, we think maybe they'll exist forever, but probably not. They probably decay, right? And once everything decays into this just sort of diffuse energy state over 100 trillion years, all of a sudden, Roger Penrose, a very famous physicist, found that the geometry of this universe that is just full of nothing is the exact same geometry as that of the Big Bang, of this infinitely small, dense universe, right? And so all of a sudden this question comes up again, right? Well, what does it mean to exist? Where does time start and end? And what does any of it really mean, right? It becomes very complicated.
Well, it is. And one of the things that kind of puts a lot of these metaphysical questions to rest is in the historical Buddha. I'm sorry to reference that so much, but he couldn't discern. There was no discernible beginning, no discernible end. So if there's not a first cause to reckon with, then it does kind of put some of the metaphysical questions to rest, or they're not really helpful, right, at a certain point. Because if there is no discernible beginning, no discernible end, well, then there's no need to come up with theories like the Big Bang, or maybe there was tons of them over cycles and cycles and things like this. But if you can't determine the beginning or end, of course, that's only done with so-called psychic powers in a way. I don't know if if they have instruments to measure things like this. I'm sure they're highly classified, right? Or we can, get so far with the astronomical techniques or whatever. I'm guessing, but what this opens up to me now is these bigger, what's called the two extremes, and you have on one extreme we have eternalism, which to me is a trap because even if I wanted to get out of that, I couldn't, right? And then there's also moral challenges because if it just goes on and on forever, then who cares about right now? I can really do whatever I want and then just deal with it later, right? Or just have some divine intervention that's running everything, and then that's just I'm just doing the will of that, which I don't know. I'm not saying that's not the case. I'm just saying with that opens up another can of worms. But then there's the other extreme, which I'm wondering, how you deal with this with the title like from nothing to nowhere, or was it from so or vice versa? Nowhere to nothing. And so there's this extreme that kind of goes into nihilism. I'm not saying that's a nihilistic view, but then it's just like, everything would just be better off if we just blew up everything, or who gives a shit about anything because it doesn't really matter. It's everything. It's meaningless and there's no purpose or nothing. So who cares however I behave or do anything because, it doesn't mean anything anyway, right? Or in the long run. So, this is, I guess, where some of these extreme extremes can lead to. I'm not saying you're doing this or anything, but it does bring up this notion of purpose. What's the point of all this, though? And so I'll put that to you there, and then maybe we can get into some ethical things if you'd like as well.
Sure. Yeah, there's two things that you were sort of getting at there, and I think that the one is purpose, but I think before purpose, what comes is sort of epistemology, right? How do we know things? And I think that that's an important part of what you were just mentioning. And it's something that we struggle with on the podcast week in and week out, right? It's this sort of battle for the
Sure.
soul of philosophy, right? Between nihilism and religion in some ways, right?
Sure.
This idea that nothing means anything and that you can't know anything. And so it's all relativistic
Well, that's
versus,
solipsistic too, right? That can
yeah,
run
yeah,
into
exactly.
solipsism, and we have to know it for ourselves. But go on, yes.
Yeah, versus, the on the other side, this idea that, well, if we can know something and if there is some sort of purpose, where do we say that it comes from, right? Because if we view the universe in a strictly Newtonian way, right, every effect must have a cause. And so there must be an initial cause that didn't have an effect, and that sure seems theistic, right? And so,
Yes, first cause, yes. Yeah.
yeah, so these are the things that we struggle with week in and week out.
Hmm.
But it's my view, right, that we can come to know things, right? And I
Sure.
think that if you look at the human species and the way that it's advanced over the phylogeny of the species, we've obviously made progress and advancements, some of which are good, some of which are bad. But there's been things that have happened as the result of knowledge that we've gained. However, that's always couched within the limitations of the human being, and even the human species, right? Because like you were mentioning before, color, right? We just talked about color. Color doesn't exist in reality, but we all see it. But we all see it differently, right? We all have three color receptors: red, blue, green. None of us see yellow. Yellow is just what our brain fills in as it says, oh, this is this frequency band. We'll see it as yellow, right? Except for there's about 25% of women that have a fourth color receptor that allow them to see millions of more colors than the rest of us, right? So the world that they see is different. And of course, you can take it, somebody who's blind, somebody who's deaf, somebody who grew up in a certain cultural context versus another, right? Certain areas of the world. Everybody sees things a little bit differently. It doesn't mean that it's all relativistic, that there's nothing out there. There's definitely something out there. But by the time you piece together all of the different facets of perspective of people around the world, you'll get almost every single different answer that you could possibly imagine, right? And so we use tools like science, we use tools like philosophical rationalism to try to come to know what the truth is. And of course, truth, right? Like purpose, like knowledge, very tricky subject.
Yes.
But there's ways of coming to know things, right?
Sure.
So epistemology is a big one.
Hmm.
As far as purpose, the way that sort of blends into purpose, right, is I think that when people think about the purpose or the meaning of human life and human existence, I think that the main mistake there is the overarching application to the entire human race, right? I think the purpose or meaning is something that is relativistic, right? That one's relative to you as a person, right? As far as we know, there is no dictates about what the meaning is or what the purpose is. So that's something that you have to make for yourself, right? And so if you sort of cede that decision to your underlying emotions, I think you come up with existential angst, right? All of a sudden you think about life as being all there is, and you're afraid of doing it wrong, and you're afraid of death, and it's just governed by fear, right? Whereas there's other ways of approaching it, right? Depending on what your overarching philosophy of life is. But I think ultimately, as far as meaning and purpose goes, that's something that each person does make for themselves.
Yes, and when it comes to truth, I found helpful the rubric of like relative truth, or yes, and then there's an absolute. So the kind of the absolute truth, you can kind of point at it, but can't tell someone the absolute truth, right? So we can get back to Netflix and get done with this philosophy and enlightenment project, right? But on a relative level that we deal with, yes, we have this experience of color. Is there any way to kind of verify scientifically that color is exactly one thing and not another, right? That there is. So yeah, I don't think there is, but we all have this experience of color or lack of color, right? Even if, unless I guess blind or there's some physical thing but is it, an isolated type of thing that can be measured by scientific instruments? I don't think that's the case,
Yeah, it's
right?
it's
You know
it's
what I
funny
mean?
because
And then our
yeah,
perception of it, our perception, go ahead.
and this is where science. I'm studying to be a scientist, a social scientist, right? So I take science very seriously as our best way of coming to know things. But what makes science so great is also what gives people an overconfidence in science, and that
Yes.
is categorization, right?
Yes.
So science is just going to look at a frequency of light and say, okay, well, from 450 millibars to 700 millibars is a certain color. And it's completely arbitrary, right? So you're saying at 449 millibars, right, suddenly that section between green and blue is, well, this is green and this is blue. No, that doesn't exist. That's a human made
True.
thing, right? And that's the way a lot of speaking about knowledge and speaking about truth, right? The knowledge is understanding the millibars and understanding what they represent and how we perceive them and laying it out. And so we can come to know that. But truth, is it true that it's green or blue or whatever? That's a little bit more arbitrary, right? Like, which isn't to say that, again, it's relativistic, but it's sort of like looking at the sun, right? You can't do it. You can say, okay, well, it's over here somewhere, but I can't exactly pinpoint what's going on. So yeah, categorization is something that we, I think, again, it's what's helped us advance as far as we have, part of what makes us human. But it's also part of the problem that we have. A big part of the problem that we have is this over reliance on categorization.
Well, totally. And I think it needs to, truth needs to be arrived at through investigation, obviously. And it needs to be known directly all the way through the bodily level. Deep into the body is how truth needs to be known ultimately. And so there's a whole line of arriving at truth in one of the suttas. And I'm not going to go into that now because I'm not really up on it too. But again, so we can look at, right, the color, we just look at people's experience of it, right? And there's some kind of consensus of this experience that we name color. But, like you're saying, that's just a consensus. It doesn't mean it's a reality, but it doesn't mean it's the reality, right? And yeah, colorblind people and things like this. But the other thing that's a distinction that some advanced practitioners go into is ultimate mentality and ultimate materiality. And the ultimate mentality is, or name and form. The ultimate materiality I won't go into, but this goes back to kind of what I guess some of the Greeks had an understanding of, this subdividing physical matter, right? Well, apparently they say there's this subatomic particle called a kalapa, and within this kalapa has so many other, I don't know if it's 7 or 8 characteristics within this thing, but this is allegedly, and I'm not at this level, can be discerned by advanced meditators. Like they see and know this for themselves, right? And so I think this notion of inviting science to, if they can't measure it with a machine or an instrument, they disregard it basically, or it falls into the realms of psychology or philosophy. So they're not really using the human instrument of consciousness to investigate things in order for truth, as far as I know, at least on a massive scale. Of course, consciousness studies itself is opened up. But as far as using the human mind, the human observation as a definable instrument, they don't seem to be as far advanced as in the East in that as well. The other thing I wanted to ask you, how do we, and then we get the observer effect, but how do we double blind test for the observer effect? And also, the big question I have that I haven't got is so much of mathematics and science is based on randomness, but can we mathematically prove randomness?
Yeah, it's because something is random until you detect a pattern, right? But how long can something go before you detect a pattern, right? So if you had a string of numbers that started, at the beginning of the universe and it was random, but then all of a sudden you detected a pattern, now versus then,
But
well,
that
then it
supposes
ceases
the
to be.
start of the universe too. So there, yeah, go keep going. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it just ceases to be random at that point, right? Then you do see a repeating pattern. It just takes 13 billion years to repeat or whatever, right? So
But
yeah, can
can they actually mathematically prove randomness through like an equation? You know what I mean? Or does it? I don't know if that makes sense or not, but
yeah, I'm not sure.
yeah,
I'm not that far into the mathematics of it.
yeah.
But I know that much, which is that something is random until you observe a pattern. But you might not, if a pattern takes 13 billion years to repeat, we might look at something and consider it to be random, but the pattern might just repeat so infrequently that we just haven't had time to observe the pattern. So
Well,
that's
that's
what
what
makes randomness
that
hard. Yeah.
or what we're calling random. Maybe it isn't. We're just maybe we don't have the faculties to detect a pattern when what we're considering random, or maybe we don't understand what we're considering random. And then there's all these experiments that consciousness can affect random number generators, And so this gets into the fact of double blind testing, and the observer effect. But the observer effect, of course, right, is actually changing the outcome of the experiment. But how do you scientifically, rule the observer effect in or out, or the degree of the observer effect? Because that needs to be, you can't double blind that, right? Because there's no way, because the observer effect or structuring the experiment, whatever, should have some kind of influence whatsoever. So does that conclude that that the observer effect, what's the conclusion with the observer effect itself if it can't be put into a double blind study? So
Yeah, it's something that's been observed in um, physics experiments on the simplest level, right? So you're sort of sending waves of light through this mirror trap, right, from mirror to mirror to mirror to mirror to mirror. And what they've discovered through different scientific instruments, right, is that if you just let the thing go, the pattern that the light sort of displays on a wall or on a display is a pattern of a wave. But if you observe the wave, if you look at the light, now all of a sudden the wave looks as a scattering of particles, right? So that's this
but how can
wave particle duality thing where you go, oh,
right.
wait a minute, and they've even discovered this retroactively, right? So
Hmm.
if you let the experiment run and it's showing you that it's a wave, and then you go back and observe a previous part of it, it will be a particle, right? So it's both a wave and a particle at the same time, depending on the observer. So that's sort of the observer effect.
But how do
But
you?
it can really
Yeah,
only be measured in a very simplistic sort of experiment like that, right? Scaling it up to, um, the
sure.
multifaceted complexity of human consciousness and the role that it plays
Right.
on impacting the things around it. That's beyond science at this point.
Exactly. And they're not testing the observation itself. Like they're not, you know what I mean? They're seeing that observing does an effect, but they're not observing the observing. So it's like a thousand turtles, it's turtles all the way down, right? So they've got, so they're not testing the actual act of observing. So you have to observe the effect of observing, but then that observation that's observing the observing, that what kind of observation effect does that have on it? So what I'm saying is that can never really be put in isolation in order, because either it is kind of like a binary thing. Either there's observation or there's not, right? So you'll never be able to study it in that sense. How many observations of observations levels deep are we going to go, and how infinitesimal of anyway. So that's kind of the point, that they can't really double blind test, as far as I know, the observing of the observing, and so which that would raise other questions. So
Yeah.
kind
Yeah,
of got in
and
the weeds there a little bit, but go
no,
ahead.
no, that's all right. And there's philosophers of science who posit that that's why consciousness is a fundamental aspect of the universe rather than an emergent aspect. And it's not a common view in science, right? Most people kind of go, okay, whatever. But it's this view that, okay, well, consciousness, you can't really explain it any other way.
Well,
And
let's define
and even
consciousness first before you start talking about. Sorry to cut you off, but like, what do you mean by consciousness? What is that first? And then, sorry to interrupt, but pick off because I don't know what we mean by consciousness. That needs to
yeah,
be, you know what I'm sorry, but yeah.
it's sort of it's an awareness, right? And it's sort of brings us back to our very first question, right? This idea of self. So it's this awareness of a self-referentiality, right? This my ability to say, hey, I'm here and I know what I means, right? Which again, we've talked about this idea that we actually know what I means, but it's at least that feeling, right? That I'm here and I know what I is, right? So consciousness, this idea of panpsychism is what they call it. That every molecule, every atom in the universe has some level of consciousness, and then if you sort of build things on top of each other and they combine in a certain way, suddenly you get a conscious being, right? An animal, or a human, or whatever it might be. So philosophers of science have sort of thought about this idea of an observation in that way. Like I said, it's not a widely held view, but it's been suggested. Another thing that we were sort of talking about was my most recent episode on my podcast, which is mereology, right? This idea that the study of how parts come together to make a whole thing. And that episode, one thing we talk about is what is a whole? What are parts, right? Because every part has parts that make it up, so that part is a whole, and every whole is part of a bigger thing.
Very
so
fractal.
It's a part. Yeah. So it's this sort of it's again, it's not arbitrary categorization, because we can, right? If you don't have all the parts for an engine, you're not going to have a car that runs. So it's not relativistic. It's not arbitrary. You do need parts in order to make a whole, but a whole what, right? Because even a car engine, if you take it out of the car, doesn't do anything, right? It doesn't have a purpose, right? And so when we look at the human being and we say, well, what is consciousness? Well, consciousness is sort of what makes us what we are. Because if you didn't have that, you wouldn't have a human being. And talking from the psychological viewpoint, right? That's the biggest question in psychology. That's part of the reason I got into it is to look at this question of, well, where is consciousness in the brain, right? And it's a highly distributed thing, right? From what we can tell, consciousness, there's no part of the brain where consciousness is. It's spread throughout the whole brain in different ways. And a lot of your senses are, like we've been talking about sight quite a bit here. Part of your sight is in your eyes. Part of it is in your occipital lobe. Part of it is in your prefrontal cortex. And damage to any one of those sites causes different problems, right? If you have damage to the occipital lobe, but your eyes and your prefrontal cortex are fine, what'll happen is you'll have blind sight, is what they call it, which is where you'll report being blind. You'll say, I can't see anything, nothing. But if I hold a ball out to you, you will hold your hand exactly how you need to grab the ball. Or if I can hand you a box, you'll put your hands out exactly. If I ask you where the light is shining from, you'll say, oh, I have no idea. And I'll say, well, just guess. And you'll point to the light every single time, right? So the eyes are passing the message onto the brain, but just the part of the brain that makes sense of what's going on is broken. It doesn't work anymore. So the message is getting through and it's operating the way it's supposed to, but the part that says it is working doesn't work. So yeah, the human mind is very complex, and that's what adds to this hard discussion about what consciousness is and what the self is.
It is, and one of the ways I've heard it is that what if the brain is actually just a receiver? So that answers a lot of questions too, if it's receiving consciousness. So I think it's some of the other teachings that there's a sixfold consciousness. There's each of the five individual senses, and then the sixth sense being mind consciousness. So when there's a physical organ meets a sense object and there's contact, eye consciousness arises. When a physical ear meets a sound object, then ear consciousness arises, and so on with the five senses. And then when the mind meets an contacts a mind object, mind consciousness arises. And so, yeah, and then we have like the notion of the heart too that comes into this, and the notion of the kind of the thinking mind. But there's also kind of awareness, like you're talking about too. So awareness, to me, it's one of the more easier ones to understand because it's just a bare knowing, right? Awareness can't be defiled, and it can't be purified. Its job is just to know, right? It can be simplified into knowing and what's being known, just about any phenomena. So it's the knowing and what's being known in our relative experience as well. So yeah, and then even consciousness itself is the same thing. You talked a little bit earlier about the parts in the whole. The perception I find it helpful with that is a compounded thing, right? Something is made up of other things, but what is compounded is subject to decay. Whatever is subject to compounded things, their nature is to break apart eventually, right? They come together and they break apart. This is a characteristic of existence, just like this inherent unsatisfactoriness in life, this stressful nature of experience, and then there's this empty nature, that there is no long-lasting, permanent thing we call self. It's kind of a bunch of processes and experiences that are arising and falling. Can't really pin down an essence or something that doesn't change, that is eternal, or has an isolated substance to it. And these are the three characteristics of existence that are said here. Now, I said coming back again to ethics. So I want to talk about your notion of ethics, and if it's okay to push a little bit into this notion of war, and and it's a sensitive topic here because to me, this is just my feelings. I mean, I come from a background where I've got, World War II vet grandfather who was 82nd Airborne, 5 battle jumps, one of the few that made it out without much serious damage. Another grandfather, it was Air Force, and then my dad was in the Navy. My uncle was in the Navy in a nuclear sub in the North Sea during, Vietnam time. But so to me, it blows my mind to think that that one group of adults can vote and send another group of adults to go kill people for reasons that maybe might not be clear, that might not be understood, that get backed by all kinds of reasons and good reasoning, or not. I don't know about good, but so where I come from with ethics is non-harming, right? So non-harming is kind of where I base that as well. And people say, well, what's harm? Well, we know when we're being harmed, right? So that's kind of maybe one guideline. And then we've got the further complication of people that go over and kill, that one group of adults said they need to go kill, or they should be killed, and it's voluntary, right? Or they want, there's whole notions of that. But then we come back and there's a veteran. And so the veteran programming has to kind of rebuild some people and reintegrate them into society, at the same time not interfere with war programming to make it okay to go over and kill strangers. And maybe I'm off here on my setup and my premise, but please let me know how your feelings and thoughts about this, as it on that, and with
Yeah.
ethics too. So.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think I know what you're getting at. And, you know, much the true philosopher that I am, right? It drives people nuts because my show is called From Nowhere to Nothing, right? It's named that for a reason, right? We spend a whole hour looking at one word and really digging deep into it. And usually at the end we go, well, we made some progress, but can we say we definitively know something about it? probably not, because everything that you look at is just so complex, right? There's nothing that just sort of stands alone. You can say, yep, black and white, this is a certain way. War and violence really is quite similar, right? When I was in the army, I was in a different point in my life. I don't think I would join now, right? So I was a different person, which is a self statement, right? But even reflecting on it now, I mean, as recently as last week, I had to physically subdue somebody, right? And
Wow, I'm
you
sorry,
know,
dude.
yeah, it's not
Wow.
something that you want to do, but at the same time, when you do it, right, the reason for it was because I had seen somebody punch another individual, right, and so I knew that I could step in and kind of stop the situation from going any further. So I'm very much with you, right? I've looked at a lot of Eastern practices, and I want to do no harm to anybody as best that I can. Um, but then on the flip side, right, what the complexity of that is there a way in which you can do harm that is ethically um, sanctioned, right? Um, and I think that when we look at it on an individual level, right, because there's variations of this in Eastern religions, but by and large, most of the time, that the view is no, never. It's never okay to do violence. Um, and I think I would push back against that a little bit, right? I think that if you can prevent further violence from being done, I think that you're justified in doing so. But when you scale that up to human civilizations, right, and nations and these sorts of things, and you look at the reasons for wars, the more you scale it up, right, with one person is already complex enough. But when you scale it up to a nation state, and all of a sudden you add in that complexity, right, and you look at economic factors and global positioning and geography and all of the factors that are actually being considered, whatever moral consideration there might be for conducting a war, there's a lot of other just sort of cold economic calculus that goes along with it that is not moral, right? And so trying to determine what is a justified war, right? If you can prevent more deaths than would be caused if you didn't join in, I think that you might be able to make a case it's justified. But there's so many things that can happen after that point, right? Is then the nation that you jumped in to defend, do they owe you some kind of payment for your services, right? Are you expecting them to cooperate with you in some way? There's a lot of questions that take place that really call into question, how can you say that something is black and white ethical? And I think that at that level there really isn't, right? I think that war is all shades of gray, and I think that it's very dark shades of gray because it's not a good thing to begin with.
And I wanted to add a little thing in there. Like, even though I am a big second or big enough, significant Second Amendment rights person, no one, what do they call it? Oh, it's a principle, but basically, no one has the right to aggress on another. However, if someone aggresses on them, they have the right to protect themselves. So who am I to say that someone can't defend their own life or defend the life of someone they love? That's none of my business. I mean, I might choose, since I don't have, kids or anything like that, I might choose to just I don't know karate, but I know crazy. But so, but you're right. And the thing is, though, I would say yes. If an individual or a nation state, anybody, whatever we want to classify it, knows with absolute certainty beyond a doubt that what their action is going to do in the long run is going to contribute to the highest welfare and happiness of themselves and all beings, then I say that's something different. However, from where I stand now, that would take in someone to be omniscient. because the long term is could be a really long term, And so
Yeah.
that's right. There's so many causes and conditions that go into our thoughts, our speeches, or actions that it's just unfathomable, And just think about all the potential choices we have, like all the blades of grass in your yard. You could actually go out there and pick any number of them, and spend all kinds of time. And we think of all the different things that come into making a single choice point, and how if we choose different things might happen differently. And then we throw all condition upon condition and causes upon causes, and it's just unfathomable. It would make one go mad, considering all the ins and outs of the actions and fruits of actions, right? Cause and effect. I know you had a podcast about that recently, and it doesn't seem there's ever any one cause either. This notion of codependent arising and conditional, this is where this wheel of conditionality, the codependent arising, is really helpful, because you can't really just isolate anything, because everything's interconnected, interdependent. And so, yeah, so to me, it's just easier to engage in non-harming for the most part, like you're saying, unless like but I also encourage people to speak out. If they see somebody, getting beaten up in the street, and they just turn a blind eye when they can actually help, especially in the long run for themselves, for both people involved, then yes, wise action should be taken, actually, and it can prevent harm if wise action's taken. But yeah, to
Yeah.
mm,
Yeah. The Jainists, right? That's an Eastern philosophy
yes.
that is, more than anybody else about non-harm,
Yes.
right? They'll
It,
they'll
it,
sweep bugs
it's
out of
extreme. It's
yeah
extreme.
sweep
Very, go ahead. Yeah.
sweep bugs out of the way so that they don't
Yeah.
step on them, that sort of thing. But you know who came from that school was Gandhi, right? And
Yeah.
he accomplished a lot through
Yeah. Yeah.
non-harm, like you said, by speaking out, right? By identifying wrongs.
Mm-hmm.
I think that in this area, Western philosophy can help a little bit. I like the views of David Hume, who said that it's not okay to use violence to protect yourself, but it's okay to use violence to protect somebody else, right? And I think back to this situation that I had last week, and I go, if I was the guy who got hit, I probably wouldn't hit back, right? And I think that would have ended this situation. But as somebody who watched somebody else get hit, right, I want to step in and help them, right? And there's another Zen parable, right, where there was a warlord that came through, and he was just malicious, just killing everybody. And he came up to a Zen temple, and he found this master meditating, and he said, hey, kneel to me. And he's like, don't you know I'm the kind of guy who can run you through with a sword without blinking an eye? And the Zen master just looked at him and said, don't you know I'm the kind of man that can be run through with a sword without blinking an eye, right? And I think that that's sort of the ideal, right, is you want to be somebody who's so emotionally stable and so, assured in your views that you can take that kind of harm without it actually damaging you. And I think that's what people should aspire to, right? Is obtaining a type of personal inner peace where no harm can be done to you, right? It's just whether it's physical or psychological, you have ways of staying calm through it.
Yeah, it's a tough one, because that self-responsibility, that speaks to self-responsibility, and a courageousness and a fearlessness. The thing where I feel it possibly will come into issues, and this is why the mind needs to be trained so much, is because the discernment that my action is actually going to do more benefit than harm. Because what happens if then who I stepped in and intervened with, they get really have a lot of retribution, and so they whip up all their families, our friends, and they come after your family, and then all this just blows up into something that, but then we have to make that choice too. Do we take that on, or do we let this innocent person, or whatever's going there? And it's just the causes and conditions are so complex. It could be the result of their past actions coming to fruition, right? And this is one of the reasons I've heard about war too, that it will never be stopped, or it's going to be a hard time to be stopped, is because a lot of it is these past actions coming to fruition now, because of certain past actions that now they're fruit fruiting in this at the same time others are fruiting, and then it plays out through this theater of war and things like this. So it really is a tough one, which, like you're saying, it doesn't have really any good answers. And at the end of the day, we kind of have to trust our own discernment and our own, our own ability to act or not act. And then we have to be willing to, if there's consequences to those actions, taking self-responsibility, like you're saying, and being open to doing what's the best we can in that moment for our long-term well-being and that of others. Yeah. So I really appreciate today going through that at the end. It's a challenging one, I know, but I think it's a much needed one, especially the hour we're in here.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that you can see it. I think you made a really good point, right? Which is that the actions that we take now do have far-ranging consequences, and you look at that around the world. The more harm that's done, certainly the harder it is to, for that conflict to end, right? And we're seeing that unfold in the Middle East over 2,000 years, right? At some point, you go, can this even be reconciled? Because so much harm has been done on both sides that there's something about it that is becoming very hard to disconnect from. So on our own level, yeah, no, I totally agree. If you can do no harm, or if you can restrain yourself, from taking that defensive position, I think that ends it right there, right? It doesn't continue into the future.
That's right, breaking that cycle, and it's we can't just rely on it. And this gets into victimizer cycles, right? We get victimized and turn around and become the perpetrator, the bully. It's a huge program playing in, especially to males as well. And like you said earlier, it's the financial shenanigans. Our economy is based on debt and war. Basically, that's how it functions. And we have financiers funding both sides for profit, right? And creating kind of questionable skirmishes in order to keep the economy going or to get rich. And a lot of people don't know the ins and outs of all these different things of how certain wars are financed and all these things. So it's again, the causes and conditions are quite complex when it comes to this. Well, Joel, I appreciate coming here. It was such a pleasure and honor talking to you, and it's kind of refreshing to see your depth of knowledge in psychology and just open-mindedness and interest and wanting to delve deep into so many of these topics. And I didn't even get to ask you about your other work, like the electrical grid. Wow, that's talk about national security type thing that's possible there, and all your other artistic interests is very admirable too. The world definitely could benefit from more beauty and expression there as well. So why don't you tell people about how they can get in touch with you? What you have going on. You mentioned a book already. If you have events, anything special coming up on your podcast, anything else you want to draw people's attention to, and then take us out on what message you want to leave the audience with today.
Sure. So I'm the world's worst marketer, right? I don't like doing it, so I'm not good at it. A bit hard to find, right? But if you like listening, if you like my music, you can find it. Just search for my name, Apple Music, Spotify, anywhere. The podcast, again, anywhere you listen to podcasts, Spotify or wherever. My book, not out yet, but it will be by the end of the summer. The Sleeper, the Scholar, and the Strix. So if you want to get a hold of me, you'll probably want to email through the podcast from nordanothingpodcast@gmail.com. Real short and succinct email address, not hard to type out at all. So feel free to get to me through there. Suggest a topic. We'll cover it on the show. Might not be right away, but we'll definitely cover anything that you want to talk about. And that's pretty much it. And as far as as far as the message goes, I think that we've covered a lot of it today, right? Which is, do no harm, and really, the point of philosophy and the point of to me, the point of being human, right, is to dig below the surface, right? To not just hear the word self and think you know what it means, or hear the word consciousness and think you know what it means, or hear the word harm, right, and think you know what it means. When you hear these things, always dig a little deeper into what the meaning is, and you'll always be a better human being for it.
Well, beautiful. May all beings everywhere come to know reality for what it really is. May they realize full awakening and be free. Bye now.